last couple of weeks, we've repeatedly heard the Prison Governors Association and the prison officers saying there is a staffing crisis here.
Have you, did you during the course of making the documentary to go to the authorities and say, look, this is what we're uncovering, what are you doing about it?
We have, obviously a programme like this has to be very carefully assembled. In the last few weeks we've gone to the government and we've told them some of the stuff we've found. What they told us is what Liz Truss announced publicly in the last week or so, which is that they are trying to do something about recruiting more prison staff, and they acknowledge the extent of the problem. They don't describe it as a crisis, but they do acknowledge that there is a problem.
And actually, I mean, even if you had more staff, phones are so ubiquitous, number one, but also so easy to smuggle in a way. Wouldn't it be terribly easy, would it, to well, I suppose you could bear down on it, but you couldn't get rid of them.
There's two things really. The phones demonstrate the problem, and that's what the documentary does. It's the underlying issues that I think are the important ones. It is the epidemic of violence and drugs and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, if you take someone's liberty away, they shouldn't be allowed to communicate with the outside world willy-nilly. So phones are a problem in that respect. But I think what the documentary really demonstrates is, from the prisoner's perspective, you suddenly see what's actually really going on inside. And I think that's probably the thing we should focus on. There are various measures that are being discussed about making the phones less effective, blocking the signal, that sort of thing. But I think it's really, people need to concentrate on what you see.
Yes, and blocking the signal in a sense wouldn't help, would it? Because if you're talking about films being filmed on phones and then smuggled out.
So they could be
signal side of it is not terrible.
Yeah, but these videos are uploaded onto Instagram and various other social media platforms.
But they could still be uploaded outside.
I'm sure that's the case.
If necessary. Did you have the impression that the prisoners themselves, that this was part of a kind of gang thing, that people are controlling these phones, that there is a sort of sense of their availability being part of as with drugs, part of a kind of structure within the prison?
Unquestionably. I mean, partly because although there are lots of the phones are flooded, the wings are flooded with the phones are quite valuable when you're in there. So the hierarchy of prisoners, I think, does mean that the more senior, the bigger members of the gangs do have more control of over those phones, and the more vulnerable prisoners are the ones who are effectively perform the forfeits on camera in order to be given a little bit of spice.
And that's the point, isn't it? That it is essentially about bullying. I mean, it's and really appalling. The word bullying,
I think, really almost doesn't properly capture it. It's quite horrific to witness.
Well, the programme is called The Secret Life of Prisons, as I was saying. It goes out, when does it go out?
Tonight at 9 o'clock on Channel 4.
9 o'clock.
Part of the Cutting Edge documentary strand.
Okay, well, Simon Ford, who was executive producer, indeed is executive producer of that programme, thank you very much. That is just about it for today. Melvyn Bragg is coming up next from Nick, and from me, it's time to say goodbye. Tom Field and Sarah Nelson are editors. Good morning.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. Donald Trump will visit the White House today to discuss the handover of power from President Obama after his stunning victory in the US election. There have been protests by anti-Trump demonstrators in several American cities, but some senior Republicans have rallied round the billionaire businessman after distancing themselves during his campaign. Police say they're investigating the possibility that a tram driver who crashed in South London yesterday fell asleep or had a blackout. 7 people died when the vehicle overturned on a sharp bend in Croydon in South London. The driver has been arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. Andrew Braddock, the director of the industry's trade body UK Tram, said they'd learned lessons from what had happened.
A tram reacts like a bus, and the driver is creating much the same issues as a bus. We UK Tram work closely with the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, and of course with the Office of Rail and Road through Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate, beautifully named. We will be studying their report in immense detail, and I've no doubt there will be lessons learned from that.
One of 2 men who escaped from London's Pentonville prison by cutting through the cell bars has been recaptured. Matthew Baker, who was awaiting sentencing for attempted murder, was arrested in northeast London last night. His fellow inmate, James Whitlock, is still at large. A British financial trader has been allowed to return to the UK after admitting he helped trigger a multi-billion-dollar Wall Street crash in 2010. Navinder Sarao, who's 37 and from Hounslow, was in shackles when he appeared in a Chicago courtroom. He was told he faces up to 30 years in prison. Scientists have developed a device that has allowed 2 monkeys to regain the use of their paralyzed legs. It transmits brain signals across the damaged spinal cord to activate the leg muscles. Researchers say it has potential to be used on humans. England's cricketers are setting a big total in the first test against India in Rajkot. A little while ago, they were 518 for 9. BBC News.
We learn all sorts of things about apples and fruit growing from Pete Brown, the author of the Book of the Week, in 45 minutes. First, it's time to learn about the heroine of Trafalgar. Here's Melvin Bragg with In Our Time.
Hello, The Fighting Temeraire from 1839 is one of Turner's greatest works, the one he called his darling. It shows a famous ship of the age, a hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, on its final journey, being towed up the Thames to the breaker's yard. Most of the canvas is sky, an extraordinary, largely orange sunset reflected in still water. Near the bottom left centre is a small, black, fiery tugboat from the new age of steam, paddles churning. The Temeraire, full-masted from the age of sail, ethereal and white, glides behind to its face. When Turner first displayed this masterpiece, the Victorian public was deep in celebrations of the Temeraire era, with work on Nelson's column underway in the new Trafalgar Square, and Thackeray described the painting as a national ode. With me to discuss the Fighting Temeraire are Susan Foyster, curator of early Netherlandish, German and British painting at the National Gallery, David Benny Brown, the Manton curator of British Art at Tate Britain, and James Davey, curator of naval history at the National Maritime Museum. Susan Foyster, where was Turner in his career in 1839?
Well, he was at the height of his powers as a painter, extremely successful. In his early 60s, he had achieved success as a painter when he was very young. He was appointed a full member of the Royal Academy when he was only 26 in 1802, and he achieved the success that allowed him to be commercially successful, to create his own gallery where he would show his paintings, as well as continue to exhibit at the Royal Academy. In 1839, when the Temeraire was exhibited, he showed 3 other paintings alongside it. So he was immensely productive, immensely busy, a very well-travelled man, and he had by that stage complete command of the powers of painting, and he had transformed the genres of paintings. So landscape painting, seascapes really became something else through Turner, something much more poetic and historic and meaningful, and he was able to use light and colour and the ways in which he painted to really transform people's experience of looking at those kinds of scenes. He had an immense sense of history and of his own place in history. I think he was always
A little while yet, so you will need to find an alternative route around there. In the city, traffic is clearing now. It is still looking very busy on Hinkley Road from Leicester Forest East, and also on King Richard's Road towards the city centre. If you are making your way south on the M1, there's heavy traffic before junction 21A through towards Leicester at 21. It's taking that a little while to clear this morning. I'm Sally Hurst, at area traffic control.
Breakfast with Jim and Joe. BBC Radio Leicester.
So if you were in the Scouts about the subjects of his paintings, he was an unusual and original man.
It was a double track, a simple track, wasn't it? There was a track that came from being the son of a barber in Covent Garden. It was the father of a barber being a barber. His mother was condemned to what they then called the lunatic asylum in Bedlam. He was sent out to be farmed out to relatives to bring him up. But this let's call it genius, we might as well, showed very early on. His father displayed his paintings in the barber shop, and he got into it. So there's the track of that track. He never lost his Cockney accent. He never lost that sort of connection, let us say, with Covent Garden. But he had a very classical training. He went into from when he was 14, and he copied the great works and so on.
Yes, and he was very early on successful in the work of topographical landscape. So he was particularly successful as a watercolour artist early on. So he would paint subjects like Eton or Oxford or great abbeys, and these were immensely successful subjects, but could also be engraved, which was another way of making a commercial success.